I think the risk right now is deflation. The consumer price index is pretty much stable. It rose not at all last month. With energy prices, commodity prices going down, we're more likely to see deflation than inflation. There is a worry there. Milton Friedman worried a lot about the money supply. Well, the money supply measured by M1 went up 20% in the last quarter. But that's an inevitable part of putting all this liquidity into the system. What has to happen is that the liquidity has to come back out. If we get farther along this process of private markets providing credit, then the stimulus from the Fed has to be withdrawn. If we make a mistake, which is when you're moving quickly in any direction, you're likely to make a mistake, then we could get inflation over some time period. I suspect that lesson's been learned for a while, so that I don't worry about that, but it's not something that's off the table. They got to put stimulus in, but they've got to take it out as well. It may be more of a worry for if we need and we get the fiscal stimulus, because these issues are much better understood by the Fed than they are by the Congress, at least to the degree that Congress wants to communicate with the public. So it may be much harder for them to turn around than it would be for the Fed.
I wonder if the question, I don't know if the person is still here that asked the question, but was it, were you asking from an investment perspective, how do you deal with inflation?
I was thinking of what little I know about when you had hyperinflation in certain societies, and Zimbabwe springs to mind, where money becomes totally useless because all trust in money gets lost. Right. You're saying, all of you said a small percent of the total GDP is being used in these rescue packages and so forth. But we talk about trust, and if you overdo, and that's I think what that gentleman was saying, you can certainly cause money itself to become scorned and no longer trusted, because every financial transaction, when I buy a loaf of bread, it's a trust transaction. So, I was just thinking that it's hard to know, and I was wondering what you guys thought about the point at which it gets dangerous to just, because the government is just, I think it's printing money and to give us our trust. So.
Right.
Gene?
Well, I think where we are right now in terms of inflation risk is we're at a place where we're still fairly low. If you look at the components of, your general point is if the government prints too much money, there's a chance that we could get into kind of a hyperinflation situation. And there is a chance, but I think the chance there is fairly low. And if you look at the three places that make up core inflation, the three components, there's a goods component, there's a housing component, and then there's a service component. And if you look at the goods component, we still have probably excess capacity in manufacturing globally, and goods price inflation has actually been negative. So we've had deflation in goods prices. The second component is housing. And so there's a housing price component which deals with rent or the cost of housing. We've got excess capacity of housing right now in the United States, and so we have about 10.5 months of unoccupied homes in terms of monthly supply. That's very high by historical standards. So housing prices are likely to fall through 2009. So the housing component will stay stable. And then the third component is services. Now, if you look at labor globally, there's a lot of labor that's come on the market from places like India and from China. That's helping to push labor costs down. The other place where we've had problems in the past, though, with inflation is if we get into a wage price spiral. But a lot of that had to do with the strong labor unions and other things. And if you look at where the labor unions are right now, they're in, if you look at transportation industry, auto industry, airline industry, so forth, they're quite weak, and they're taking concessions right now. So there isn't any place right now that seems to be too much of a threat. So while it is a possibility, I think the probability is low.
I'd like to comment just for 1 second. So I agree with everything that you just said, and the balance of risk is clearly in the opposite direction in the near term. I'm not sure about hyperinflation or even inflation per se, but we have to remind ourselves that there will be some long-term consequences to all of this. And that may be associated with distortions in proper risk-taking and whatever that we've introduced into the system as a result of all of our rather aggressive actions right now. I don't know what they're going to be. The moral hazard analogy we're talking about, but that's certainly something that's going to challenge us in terms of long-term growth.
While we're talking about distortions, we should not forget the distortions that we've seen in the housing market.
Okay, this is for Professor Broom. Are banks issuing new stock to the U.S. or moving stocks around that are held on the balance sheet? What are the effects on the shares?
It's new stock, it's preferred stock that the government is getting, which didn't exist previously.
Will it have an effect on the banks? How could it affect the bank shares? If it's new stock coming in,
essentially the existing shareholders will be diluted because the government is now a shareholder also. It's not voting stock, so the government will not have any voting rights. And there is this dividend requirement that the government has to be paid, so that will potentially reduce available dividend pool to other shareholders.
Professor Hazen, has anyone made money on the credit default swaps? Have the counterparties made money?
By definition, the answer has to be yes, because it's a zero-sum game. There's a bilateral contract between two counterparties. If one's losing, someone else is gaining.
Right.
I think some of the gains are locked up, though. Maybe Gene can speak more of this, but I think some of the gains are locked up, and so people that are on the winning side can't capture their gains, and then their credit starts to be challenged.
I think before anyone leaves, we have to get to this question. What advice do you have for individual investors to weather the storm? It's a toughie, but I figured I'd put it out there.
I know that Chris had a couple of slides on this, which I flipped through at the end of our session.
Okay, well, number one is turn off your television and go do something else. Because you'll learn absolutely nothing from sitting and watching the gyrations of the market and getting associated freaked out factor from that. Now, that having been said, going forward, what do? Well, I think you have to use this as an opportunity to very seriously think about diversification in a number of different ways. That would not have completely saved you from this by any stretch, and I won't pretend that it is, would, but rather, that's something we have to think about going forward. Diversification across international markets, diversification across asset classes, what have you. I think that's simply going to be critical going forward. And the other thing is, I think we have to kind of look in the mirror and think a little bit about our own economic profligacy or something. We've been spending too much, we've been saving too little, and investments going forward are not going to be as important as your own savings going forward. And I think you have to sort of rethink your role in that as well.
And I'll just mention one word, bonds.
That's a good segment.
Someone else? Go ahead. A lot of people have been asking political questions. I don't know how much the panel wants to get into that, but a few questions center on, what will happen if our taxes are raised? And then one person wants to know which of the presidential candidates' economic plan is better for the short and long term. I'll leave that to your discretion.
State employees are not supposed to talk about that, right?
Well, okay.
And Gene's not, he can speak.
He's an honorary state employee for this evening.
Why don't we talk about religion and other easy things, right?
Do you want to comment on that?
No.
I really wanted to know, what is it like when the margin guy calls? What is that like? I'm trying to picture in my head, what does the margin guy really call and be like, okay, by tomorrow morning, and what do you do?
All right, well, margin calls are going on every day across the marketplace. And it's simply a call to say, the value of some of the assets that you have margin have dropped to a point where we need to see X amount of cash.
Well, does an assistant call, does Daisy call and say hi, this is, you know what I mean? How does it go down? What?
Well, we rarely get margin calls. So this is No, but what happens is what we're called buy-side firms. So we're investment managers. The sell side are the investment banks, and they're the ones that are lending the money to the buy side for the most part. And so we have coverage officers at all of the investment banks, at Goldman Sachs and at JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley and so forth. And they call our traders and portfolio managers who sit on the desk and trade the positions. And so they're in constant communication. They talk all day long. And they have direct lines with each other, and so light rings, you say, oh, it's Morgan Stanley, pick up, and then boom, you're just talking to the guy who you always talk to at Morgan Stanley, who covers us. And if that person is the one who would call us, and we would have most of our conversations with him or her. And then to go into more specific detail, we might have to go to a credit officer and have a more detailed conversation or so.
Not for personal experience, but do you ever know, like, someone who couldn't meet a margin call? What is that like, and what happens there?
Well, sure, you see that happening every day now in the marketplaces, and so you see funds shutting down. So lots of hedge funds are going out of business. And then you also see larger firms that are running into the analogous situation. So whether it's Bear Stearns or it's Lehman Brothers or AIG, I mean, they've got obligations that they can't meet, and the firms go bankrupt.